"Oh, you must be one of Ashley's neighbors. She said she put all of this together." A woman in a pastel dress told me, smiling politely as she reached for a deviled egg from the tray I had prepared at 6 that morning, and I remember standing there in my own backyard, holding a pitcher of lemonade I had just refilled, wondering how it was possible to feel invisible in a place where every single detail had passed through my hands first. I didn't correct her. I didn't even hesitate. I simply nodded and said, "Yes, it's a beautiful day for Easter." Because after 68 years of life, I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not react at all, especially when something doesn't feel like a mistake, but like a decision someone made long before you noticed it unfolding around you. The morning had started early for me, earlier than it needed to, but I've always believed that if you're going to host your family, you do it right, so by 7 a.m. I was already in the kitchen, checking the ham in the oven, stirring the glaze, making sure the sides were timed perfectly so nothing would sit too long or come out cold, because details matter, they always have to me, especially on holidays like Easter when everything is supposed to feel warm, familiar, like something you can count on. 2 weeks earlier, I had planned the entire day down to the smallest detail. From the pastel table settings to the plastic eggs hidden across the backyard for the children, even ordering a catering spread to make sure no one felt overwhelmed, though I still insisted on cooking the main dishes myself because that's what my late husband always loved, and for a moment that morning, standing there with sunlight coming through the kitchen window, I let myself believe this day would bring that feeling back, even just a little. Daniel arrived around 10, right on time as always, kissing my cheek quickly before stepping aside to help Ashley carry in a large, decorative basket I hadn't seen before. Something tall and elaborate, filled with ribbons and wrapped candies, and I remember noticing how she moved through the house like she had already been there hours before me, directing where things should go, adjusting the centerpiece I had already set, smiling in that way that didn't quite reach her eyes but still made everyone else feel like they were part of something well organized, something polished. I told myself it was a good thing, that maybe she was just trying to help, that maybe I was overthinking it. Because that's what you do when something feels slightly off but not enough to name out loud. You smooth it over in your mind, you give it a kinder explanation, you choose peace over suspicion. At least at first. By noon, the backyard was full of voices, children laughing as they ran across the grass, adults chatting in small clusters near the folding tables I had rented, and everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of my efforts scattered like evidence no one was paying attention to. The linen napkins I had ironed, the trays I had arranged, the drinks I had chilled overnight, all of it blending into the background while Ashley stood near the center, greeting guests as they arrived, accepting compliments with a soft laugh and a tilt of her head, as if she had spent days bringing this together. And maybe what unsettled me most wasn't that people believed it, but how easily they believed it, how naturally the story shifted without anyone questioning who had written it in the first place. I moved quietly between the tables, refilling glasses, adjusting chairs, doing what I had always done, making sure everyone else was comfortable before I even thought about myself. And when someone thanked me, it was brief, almost absent-minded, like thanking a server at a restaurant, polite but detached, and I told myself again that it didn't matter, that this day wasn't about recognition, it was about family, about being together, about holding on to something that feels like it's slipping faster every year. But deep down, beneath that calm voice I've practiced for decades, something else had already begun to form, something quieter, sharper. A realization that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or a moment that got away from me, this was something else entirely, something deliberate, something planned. And as I stood there watching Ashley laugh at the center of a day I had built from the ground up, I understood, not all at once but in pieces that fit together too cleanly to ignore, that I hadn't just been overlooked, I had been replaced, and the most unsettling part wasn't the lie itself, it was how effortlessly everyone had accepted it as the truth. The afternoon settled into a rhythm that should have felt familiar, the kind I had created for years without thinking, children laughing as they ran across the grass with plastic eggs tucked into their baskets, adults sipping iced tea under the mild spring sun, conversations blending into a gentle hum that usually meant everything was going right. But that day the sound felt distant to me. Like I was hearing it from the other side of a closed window, close enough to recognize but too far to be part of. I found myself standing near the long folding table where the catering trays were arranged, adjusting a serving spoon that did not need adjusting, straightening a napkin that was already perfectly placed, because small tasks gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing, or more accurately, what I was not seeing, which was any acknowledgement that this day had begun with me. Ashley's voice carried easily across the yard, warm and confident. Thanking guests for coming, explaining where the desserts were set up, even reminding the children to wait until everyone was ready before starting the egg hunt, and each word she spoke settled into the space I had prepared as if it had always belonged to her, as if the story of this day had been rewritten so smoothly that no one thought to question who had written the first draft. Daniel moved beside her. Not in the way he used to move beside me when he was younger, checking in, asking if I needed help, making sure I was not overwhelmed, but in a different way now, one that felt practiced, aligned, like he had already chosen where he stood long before this afternoon began. And when our eyes met briefly across the yard, he gave me a small smile, polite, distant, the kind of smile you offer someone you respect but no longer truly see. And that was when something shifted quietly inside me, not breaking, not even cracking, but settling into place with a clarity that left no room for denial. I remembered the past few years, moments that had seemed harmless at the time, small changes in how plans were made, how invitations were sent, how decisions were discussed without me and then presented as if they had always been that way, and I realized that this was not the beginning of anything, it was the result, the natural outcome of a pattern I had chosen not to examine too closely because it was easier to believe in good intentions than to question the people you love. A woman approached me again, holding a plate this time, asking where she could find the person who had organized the catering because she wanted to compliment them, and for a second I almost answered honestly, the words forming at the edge of my lips, but then I paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because something told me that correcting her would not change anything that had already been decided in this space, so instead I gestured lightly toward Ashley, standing near the center of the yard, and said, "You should speak with her, she will be happy to hear that." And the woman smiled and walked away without a second thought, and I stood there watching her go, realizing that sometimes the most revealing thing is not what people take from you, but how easily they believe it was never yours to begin with. I moved slowly toward the edge of the yard, where the fence met the line of early spring flowers I had planted years ago, tulips just beginning to open, their colors soft but certain, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to step back far enough to see everything at once. The decorations, the food, the laughter, the way Ashley's presence anchored it all in the eyes of everyone around her, and instead of feeling hurt in the way I might have years ago, I felt something else entirely, something quieter and far more steady, a recognition that what I was witnessing was not a moment of confusion or coincidence, but a carefully constructed version of reality, one that had been built piece by piece until it could stand on its own without me. And as I stood there with the breeze moving gently through the yard, I understood that if something had been constructed, it could also be taken apart, not with noise or confrontation, but with the same patience it had taken to build it, and that realization did not rush through me, it settled, calm and deliberate, like a decision that had already been made long before I spoke a single word. It happened just after the children finished their egg hunt, when the laughter softened into that satisfied quiet that follows excitement, and the adults gathered closer to the tables, balancing plates and drinks while the afternoon drifted into something slower, something more conversational, and I noticed Ashley standing near the center again, her hand lightly resting on Daniel's arm as she raised her voice just enough to draw attention without seeming like she was asking for it, the kind of tone that feels natural unless you are listening for it, and I found myself listening more carefully now, not out of curiosity, but out of a growing need to understand the shape of what was unfolding in front of me. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke about how much it meant to bring the family together, how important traditions were, and as she spoke, I felt a strange sense of recognition. Not because her words were unfamiliar, but because they were, in a quiet and unsettling way, my words. Phrases I had used for years, sentiments I had repeated at holidays and gatherings, now delivered with a confidence that suggested they had always belonged to her, and I stood there holding a folded napkin I had picked up without realizing it, watching as people nodded, smiled, even raised their glasses slightly in agreement, and I understood then that this was not just about credit or acknowledgement, it was about authorship. About who was seen as the one holding everything together. Someone near the back asked how long it had taken her to organize everything, and Ashley laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as if the question embarrassed her just enough to seem sincere, and she said, "Oh, it took a couple of weeks, but I love doing this, it is worth it to see everyone happy." And there was a ripple of appreciation that moved through the group, a shared understanding that she had done something generous, something thoughtful, and I felt that same quiet stillness settle deeper inside me, because 2 weeks was exactly how long I had spent planning, measuring, preparing, but hearing it spoken aloud in her voice did not feel like a coincidence anymore, it felt like a claim. Daniel added something then, a brief comment about how hard she had worked, how she had handled everything so well, and I watched him as he spoke, not searching for guilt or hesitation, but for something that might explain how easily this version of the day had taken hold, and I saw none, only a calm certainty that told me this was not a moment he was questioning, this was a reality he had already accepted. I turned slightly away, not out of retreat, but to give myself a clearer view of the space, the tables filled, the decorations catching the light. The small details I could trace back to my own hands, and I realized that nothing had been taken physically, nothing had been removed or destroyed, everything I had created was still there, intact and visible, but its meaning had shifted, its origin reassigned in a way that left no visible mark yet changed everything about how it was perceived, and that was when the final piece settled into place for me. Not with anger or even sadness, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost steadying. Because I could see now that what had been built here was not just an event, it was a narrative, and narratives, no matter how convincing, depend on what can be proven, what can be traced, what can be shown beyond a passing conversation or a polite assumption, and as the voices around me continued, warm and unaware, I felt that quiet certainty deepen, because I knew something they did not. Something that had not yet been spoken aloud, and I understood that the story being told in that backyard was not finished yet, not by a long measure. As the afternoon continued, I found myself moving back into the house for a moment, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted a different kind of quiet, the kind that walls can hold when the outside becomes too full of voices that no longer feel meant for you, and the kitchen greeted me exactly as I had left it that morning, counters wiped clean, extra dishes stacked neatly. The faint scent of glazed ham still lingering in the air, a space that still reflected my effort without interruption or reinterpretation. I stood there for a moment, letting my hand rest lightly on the edge of the counter, and my eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the details that no one else had seen, the list I had written in my own handwriting still tucked near the refrigerator, each item checked off one by one as the morning progressed, the receipts I had carefully placed in a small envelope by the coffee maker, labeled simply and clearly, because I have always believed that when you take responsibility for something, you keep a record of it, not for recognition, but for clarity. I picked up the envelope without thinking too much about it, feeling the familiar weight of paper inside, invoices from the catering company, confirmations printed out from emails, each one bearing my name, my address, my payment information, details that do not shift or bend depending on who is speaking, and as I held it in my hands I realized that while the story outside had changed, the facts inside this room had not. They remained exactly as they had been from the beginning, steady and unchanged. Waiting quietly for someone to notice them, I did not open the envelope right away. I did not need to, because I already knew what was inside, but there was something grounding about holding it, something that anchored me in a way that the voices outside could not, and for a moment I allowed myself to think back, not just to the past few weeks, but to years of doing the same thing, planning, organizing, making sure every gathering felt seamless, often without anyone asking how it came together. Because that had never been the point for me, the point had always been the feeling of connection, the sense that everyone had a place. And maybe that is why this moment felt so different, because it was not just about being overlooked, It was about being deliberately removed from the center of something I had built. I heard the back door open behind me, the soft sound of footsteps crossing into the kitchen, and when I turned slightly, I saw my granddaughter Emily standing there. Her small basket still looped over her arm, a few plastic eggs tucked inside, her expression thoughtful in a way that did not quite match the energy of the day, and she looked at me for a second before asking, "Grandma, why did Aunt Ashley say she made everything when I saw you doing all the cooking this morning?" And her voice was not accusatory or confused, just simple, direct, the kind of question that has no layers because it does not yet know how to hide behind them. I looked at her, at the openness in her face, and I felt that same calm clarity settle a little deeper, because children often see what adults choose not to acknowledge, and I knelt down slightly so we were at the same level, offering her a small smile as I said, "Sometimes people tell stories in a way that makes them feel important, sweetheart." And she nodded slowly, as if that made enough sense for now, before turning back toward the door, already pulled again by the laughter outside. When she left, I remained where I was for a moment longer, the envelope still in my hand, and I understood then that what had been happening all afternoon was not just about taking credit, it was about shaping perception, about deciding what others would believe simply by saying it first, and saying it confidently. But perception is fragile in a way facts are not, and as I placed the envelope carefully back on the counter, I realized that I did not need to interrupt the story being told outside. I did not need to correct anyone in the middle of their enjoyment, because there would be another time, another setting, one where details mattered more than impressions, and when that moment came, I would not need to raise my voice or argue my place. I would only need to present what had always been there, quietly waiting to be seen. When I stepped back outside, the light had shifted slightly, the kind of soft, golden tone that comes in the late afternoon, making everything look warmer than it really is, and for a moment, I paused at the threshold, watching the scene unfold as if I were arriving for the first time instead of having been there since before the sun came up, and it struck me how complete everything appeared, how seamless it all looked from a distance, the tables filled, the decorations holding steady in the breeze, Ashley still moving easily from group to group, her presence settled comfortably at the center of attention as if it had always belonged to her. I walked slowly along the edge of the yard, not interrupting conversations, not drawing attention, simply observing in a way I had not allowed myself to do before, and what I noticed now were the details beneath the surface, the way certain guests repeated the same phrases when speaking to Ashley, compliments that sounded almost rehearsed, the way Daniel nodded along without adding anything of his own, as if his role was not to question but to support. And I realized that this version of the day had not just appeared spontaneously, it had been guided, reinforced, repeated enough times that it no longer needed explanation. I reached the beverage table and began refilling a pitcher that was already half full, more out of habit than necessity, and as I stood there, I overheard two women speaking quietly nearby, not intending for anyone else to hear, their voices low but clear enough in the lull between conversations, and one of them said, "I cannot believe she handled all of this while managing everything at home too. That takes real dedication." And the other responded, "It shows, you can tell when someone truly cares about family." And I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me, not sharp, not painful, but confirming, because those words, those exact sentiments, had been directed toward me so many times in years past, and hearing them now, redirected so effortlessly, made it clear that what had changed was not the effort itself, but who it was attributed to. I set the pitcher down carefully, making sure it did not clatter against the table, and I looked across the yard again, this time not searching for acknowledgement, but for patterns, and I began to see them more clearly now, the way Ashley positioned herself near new arrivals, greeting them before anyone else could, the way she gently redirected conversations back to the planning of the day, the way she used small details, specific mentions of preparation and coordination, to anchor the narrative in something that sounded concrete enough to be accepted without question. And I understood then that this was not simply about taking credit in the moment, it was about establishing a version of reality early enough that it became the default. I felt a presence beside me then and turned to see Mr. Thompson, an old family friend who had known me for decades. his expression thoughtful as he glanced between me and the yard, and he said quietly, "You always did have a way of making these gatherings feel effortless." And for a second, the familiarity of his words settled over me like something steady and real, a reminder that not everything had shifted beyond recognition, and I met his eyes with a small smile, saying, "Effortless things usually take the most work." And he nodded, as if he understood more than he was saying. Before stepping away to rejoin the others, I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting that brief exchange settle into place, because it reminded me of something important, something that had not been erased despite everything else, which was that the truth of what I had done did not disappear simply because it was not being spoken aloud. It still existed, intact and verifiable, and as I looked once more at the gathering, at the way the story had been shaped and shared, I felt that quiet certainty return, stronger now, more defined. Because I could see not only what had been taken, but how it had been taken, and understanding that made all the difference, because it meant that whatever came next would not be based on assumption or emotion, but on something far more stable, something that did not need to compete for attention to be real. And as the afternoon continued, I allowed myself to step fully into that understanding, knowing that timing, like everything else that day, would matter more than any immediate reaction ever could. By the time the sun began to lower behind the trees, the gathering shifted again, plates were being cleared, conversations softened into smaller circles, and the kind of quiet satisfaction that usually follows a successful day settled over the yard. But for me, the feeling was different, not empty, not even heavy, just precise, like every moment had been carefully observed and stored exactly as it happened. And I found myself moving back toward the house once more, not in retreat, but with intention this time, because there are moments when stepping away is not about distance, it is about preparation. Inside, the kitchen remained unchanged, still carrying the calm order I had left behind, and I walked to the counter where the envelope rested, my fingers brushing lightly over its edge before I picked it up again, this time opening it slowly, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because there is a certain clarity that comes from seeing things laid out in front of you, each page holding its place without interruption, each detail steady and exact, invoices with dates, amounts, confirmations printed clearly with my name, my email, my payment records, all of it forming a quiet foundation that did not rely on memory or opinion. I placed the papers back inside carefully, aligning the edges the way I always do. And I realized that what I held was not just proof of what I had done, but something more important, a fixed point, something that could not be reshaped by a conversation or a smile or a well-timed introduction, and that understanding settled into me with a calm that felt stronger than any reaction I could have had earlier in the day. When I stepped outside again, the air felt cooler, the light softer, and I noticed that a few guests had already begun to leave, offering thanks at the gate, some of them glancing toward Ashley as they did, repeating their appreciation in the same steady pattern that had carried through the afternoon, and I watched without interruption, not because I agreed with what they believed, but because I understood now that belief, once formed, does not change in the middle of a moment, it changes when something undeniable is placed beside it. Daniel stood near the driveway, helping someone gather their things, his posture relaxed, his expression easy, and for a brief second I considered walking over, saying something simple, something that might shift his attention back toward me, but I did not, because I had already seen enough to know that this was not the time for questions, and more importantly, it was not the time for answers. Instead, I moved quietly toward the table where the remaining dishes were set, collecting what needed to be brought inside, my movements steady, familiar, and in that simplicity, I found something grounding again. A reminder that I was not reacting to what had happened, I was choosing how to move forward from it. Ashley passed by me then, her voice light as she thanked someone else, her presence still carrying the confidence of someone who believes the day has gone exactly as planned, and for the first time, I looked at her not with confusion or even disappointment, but with a clear understanding of the structure she had built, how each interaction supported the next, how each detail reinforced the story she had chosen to tell, and I realized that while it had been carefully arranged, it was also fragile in a way she might not yet recognize, because it depended entirely on perception remaining unchallenged. I carried the last tray inside and set it down gently, taking a moment to look around the quiet kitchen once more. And I understood that nothing had been lost in a way that could not be restored, nothing had been taken that could not be accounted for, and as I stood there, the noise of the gathering fading gradually behind me, I felt that same calm certainty settle deeper than before, not rushed, not uncertain, but complete, because I knew that what would come next did not need to happen in this yard, in this light, or in front of these guests. It would happen where details mattered more than impressions, where what could be shown would matter more than what had been said. And when that moment arrived, I would not need to explain anything at all. By the time the last car pulled away and the sound of tires faded down the quiet street, the house settled into a stillness that felt more honest than anything that had happened all afternoon, the kind of quiet that does not pretend to be anything else, and I stood by the kitchen window for a moment, watching the empty driveway where hours earlier guests had arrived with smiles and small talk, carrying expectations that had been so easily redirected once they stepped inside, and I let that contrast sit with me, not as something painful, but as something instructive. I moved through the house slowly, turning off lights that had been left on, straightening chairs, collecting the last few plates that had been set aside, and each motion felt deliberate, not out of habit this time, but out of awareness, because there is a difference between cleaning up after a day and closing it properly, and I intended to do the latter. Daniel came in a few minutes later, his footsteps familiar, though the space between us felt less so, and he glanced around the kitchen briefly before saying, "Everything turned out really well today." His tone casual, almost reflective, as if he were commenting on something that had simply happened on its own, and I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Yes, it did," keeping my voice even, not because I agreed with everything behind his words, but because I understood that this was not the place where anything would be clarified. He nodded, satisfied with that, and moved past me toward the refrigerator, and I watched him quietly, noticing how natural it seemed for him to move through a version of the day that did not include me in the way it once would have, and I realized again that this was not about a single conversation or a missed acknowledgement. It was about a shift that had been allowed to settle over time until it no longer felt like a shift at all. Ashley's voice followed shortly after as she stepped inside, her tone lighter now, relaxed, the confidence of the afternoon still present as she mentioned how many compliments she had received, how smoothly everything had gone, and I listened without interruption. Not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to understand. The extent of what she believed had been established, and it was clear in the way she spoke, in the ease of her words, that she did not see any reason to question it, that from her perspective, the narrative was complete. I turned back toward the counter then, picking up the envelope once more, not in a hurried way, not as if I were about to present it, but simply holding it as I had before. A quiet reminder of what remained unchanged beneath everything that had been said, and I placed it carefully into the drawer near the sink, closing it gently, not hiding it, just setting it where it belonged until it was needed. I looked around the kitchen one more time, at the space that still reflected the effort that had gone into the day, and I felt that same steady clarity settle fully into place, because I knew now that nothing I had witnessed required an immediate response. Nothing needed to be corrected in the moment it was happening, because moments pass, but records remain, and what had been built outside that afternoon, no matter how convincing, rested entirely on what people had been told, while what I held rested on what could be shown. I walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly as I passed the window again, the backyard. Now quiet, the decorations still in place but without the voices that had given them meaning earlier, and I understood that what had taken shape there would not unravel on its own, it would need to be addressed in a setting where details were not overlooked, where statements carried weight beyond polite agreement. And as I turned off the last light and let the house settle into its evening calm, I knew exactly where that setting would be. And more importantly, I knew I was already prepared for it. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm that follows a day filled with too many voices, and I woke earlier than usual, not out of restlessness, but with a sense of direction that had already settled into place before I opened my eyes, and as I moved through the house, the silence felt different now. Not empty, but clear, as if everything unnecessary had already been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. I made my coffee the same way I always do, measuring carefully, letting it brew without rushing, and I carried the cup to the small table by the window where the morning light filtered in, soft and steady, and for a moment I allowed myself to sit without thinking about anything else, just feeling the weight of the day ahead not as something heavy, but as something precise. After a few minutes, I stood and walked to the drawer by the sink, opening it without hesitation, and I took out the envelope, placing it on the table in front of me, and this time I spread the contents out fully, not just glancing at them, but arranging each page so I could see everything clearly: the catering invoice with the total amount, the payment confirmation from my bank, the email correspondence printed in full, each message timestamped, each detail fixed in a way that could not be adjusted or reinterpreted. And as I looked at them, I realized that what I had was not just evidence, it was a complete account. Something that did not depend on memory or perspective, something that stood on its own. I reached for my phone then and opened my email, scrolling through the original threads, confirming once again what I already knew, that every arrangement, every decision, every payment had come directly from me, and I took a moment to forward those emails to myself again, organizing them into a single folder, not because I was uncertain, but because clarity is strengthened by order, and I have always believed that when something matters, you prepare for it properly. I thought briefly about the day before, about the way the story had unfolded, how easily it had been accepted, and I understood now that what had happened was not accidental, it was structured, built on timing and repetition, and that meant it could not be addressed casually. It required a setting where details were not just heard, but examined, and as that thought settled, I reached for my planner, the one I have kept for years, and I opened it to the week ahead, turning the pages slowly until I found the space I was looking for. I picked up a pen and wrote a single appointment, small and neat, placing it exactly where it needed to be, not rushed, not dramatic, just clear. And when I closed the planner, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with what was coming next. The house remained quiet as I gathered the papers back into the envelope, aligning them carefully, making sure nothing was out of place, and I set it beside my bag, not hidden, not displayed, simply ready. And as I stood there, looking at the morning light stretching across the floor, I understood that what had been taken from me the day before was not something I needed to chase or argue for, it was something that would return on its own once everything was placed in the right context, because truth does not compete, it does not need to be louder or more visible, it only needs to be presented where it cannot be ignored. And as I picked up my bag and prepared to step into the day, I knew that moment was no longer somewhere in the future, it was already set, waiting exactly where I had placed it. Monday morning arrived with a kind of quiet certainty that felt different from the rest of the week, not rushed, not tense, just deliberate, and I dressed the same way I always do when something matters, simple, composed, nothing that draws attention but nothing that fades into the background either. And as I picked up my bag, I could feel the envelope inside it, not heavy, but present, a reminder of what I carried with me and why. The office building stood exactly as it always had, familiar in a way that made everything feel grounded before anything had even begun, and when I stepped inside, the air was cool, steady, untouched by the kind of shifting narratives that had filled my home just days before, and I greeted the receptionist with a small nod, giving my name and waiting calmly, because there was no need to hurry something that had already been prepared so carefully. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, his expression curious more than anything else, and Ashley followed close behind, her posture composed, her confidence still intact, the same quiet assurance she had carried through the afternoon in the backyard. And I watched them as they approached, not searching for anything in their faces, but simply noting what was there, and what was not. We were led into a small conference room, the kind with clean lines and a large table that leaves no room for distraction, and as we sat down, I placed my bag beside me, my hands resting lightly on the surface in front of me, steady and still, because this was not a moment for reaction, it was a moment for clarity. The conversation began simply, introductions, a brief explanation of why we were there, and I listened without interruption, allowing the space to settle into its purpose before I moved. And when it was my turn, I reached into my bag and took out the envelope, placing it gently on the table, Not with force, not with emphasis, just enough to bring it into view. I opened it slowly, removing the documents one by one, laying them out in front of us with the same care I had used when I first arranged them, each page aligned, each detail visible, and I did not raise my voice, I did not rush. I simply spoke in the same tone I had used all my life when something needed to be understood clearly, explaining what each document represented. The invoices, the payments, the correspondence, each one tied directly to me, each one fixed in a way that did not depend on interpretation. I did not look at Ashley immediately. I did not need to, because the room itself had already shifted. The quiet taking on a different weight as the information settled into place, and when I finally lifted my eyes, I saw the change not in dramatic gestures, but in the absence of the ease that had been there before, the confidence that had carried so easily now replaced by something more uncertain, something that had to adjust to what was in front of it. Daniel's expression changed more slowly, as if he were piecing together something he had not fully questioned before, and I let that happen. Without interruption, because understanding does not need to be forced, it only needs to be allowed. I gathered my hands again, resting them calmly as the last document lay between us, and I said nothing more than what was necessary, because everything that needed to be said was already there, in ink, in dates, in records that could not be reshaped by memory or retelling, and as the silence held for a moment longer, I understood that what had been taken from me had already begun to return, not through argument, not through confrontation, but through something far simpler and far more lasting, the quiet weight of truth placed exactly where it could no longer be ignored.